Chapter 1. Introduction. What is ethics? Ethics is the philosophical discipline that deals with the foundations of human action. It asks what is right and what is wrong, what we judge to be good or bad, and how people can act in a morally responsible way in their decisions. Unlike laws or social conventions, which are often created by external constraints, ethics examines the internal principles that guide our actions and seeks to formulate universal standards of moral behavior. The term ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, which originally meant habit or character. Thus, while ethics is essentially about good action, it is also closely linked to the development of character and virtue. If you want to live a virtuous life, you need to know not only which actions are morally right, but also how these actions can be integrated into your life. Ethics is not a rigid science that provides simple answers. Rather, it is an ongoing dialogue that encourages people to question their own beliefs, analyze moral dilemmas, and consider different perspectives. A central aspect of ethics is reflection. It forces us to pause, examine our motives, and assess the consequences of our actions. The history of ethics shows that moral questions have always been a central part of human existence. In almost all cultures and at all times, philosophers, scholars, and religious founders have tried to find answers to the fundamental questions. What should I do? How can I live a good life? And what does it even mean to act morally? This book aims to trace the development of ethics from its earliest beginnings to modern times. It covers not only big names and famous theories, but also the cultural, social, and historical context that has shaped the emergence and dissemination of ethical ideas. Through this comprehensive view, it becomes clear that ethics is not a static concept, but is constantly evolving to respond to new societal and technological challenges. Ethics, then, deals with concrete actions as well as general principles, and it is as practical as it is theoretical. The aim of this book is not only to impart knowledge to the reader, but also to promote the ability to think critically about moral questions, to reflect on one's own values, and to test them in practice. In the coming chapters, we will explore the history of ethics in all its diversity. From early civilizations to the great thinkers of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, to modern ethical theories and the challenges of a globalized world. This shows that ethics is not only an academic subject, but a living part of our everyday life that fundamentally influences our thinking, acting, and living together. Chapter 2. The beginnings of moral thought in antiquity. It is difficult to date the beginnings of moral thought exactly, because ethics did not emerge suddenly, but gradually developed out of the social, religious, and philosophical needs of early humanity. Even in the first advanced civilizations, which arose several millennia ago along rivers such as the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, or the Indus, an awareness of right and wrong action was evident. In these societies, morality was closely linked to practical rules of life, religious precepts, and ritual practices. It served to stabilize communities, avoid conflict, and ensure survival. In ancient Egypt, for example, ethics was inextricably linked to the idea of ma'at, the principle of order, truth, and justice. Life was considered moral if it was in accordance with ma'at. Acting virtuously meant being honest, respecting the gods, ensuring social harmony, and maintaining the balance between man and nature. Similar principles can also be found in ancient Mesopotamia, where kings such as Hammurabi wrote down ethical ideas in the famous tablets of the law. These early codes combined moral norms with legal regulations by directing people's behavior while clearly defining responsibility for misconduct. But moral thinking was not limited to practical rules. As early as ancient times, people began to question the nature of virtue and to fathom the why behind moral actions. The first philosophical reflections on justice, duty, and the good life emerged, long before ethics existed as an independent subject. The great thinkers of this time saw virtue not only as a means to social peace, but as a principle that fulfilled individual life. Those who acted virtuously lived in harmony with themselves and the world. In the Greek world, ethical thinking finally took on a systematic form, with philosophers such as the Pre-Socratics beginning to investigate the principles of nature and asking the question of the relationship between human action and the cosmic order. They laid the foundation for later ethical theories by no longer considering moral action only as a social duty, but also as part of a universal, rational principle. This early thinking made ethics an instrumental tool of the human mind that went beyond mere adherence to rules. The emergence of ethics in antiquity thus shows that moral thinking has always been closely linked to the search for meaning, order, and human self-realization. Even in the first advanced civilizations, there was the idea that life can only be considered good if it is conducted in accordance with higher principles, be it in the form of divine commandments, social norms, or philosophical reflection. These early considerations laid the foundation for the later great thinkers of antiquity, who attempted to systematically analyze and explain moral life. Chapter 3: Ethics in Ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. The early advanced civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia are among the first societies in which ethics was consciously anchored as part of social life. In Egypt, the concept of ma'at was central to moral thought. Ma'at embodied the principles of truth, order, and justice, and was both cosmic law and social norm. Those who lived according to ma'at acted justly, respected the gods, and contributed to the harmony of the community. The ethical life was inseparable from religious ideas, and moral action was manifested not only in actions towards other people, but also in personal purity and reverence for the divine. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife depended on the moral quality of life on earth, which gave people a strong motivation to practice virtue. The stories from the grave inscriptions and literary texts, such as the teachings of Ptahhotep, show that virtues such as honesty, modesty, respect for the elderly, and care for the weaker were highly valued. These early ethical ideas were strongly practice-oriented. They served to stabilize the social fabric and avoid conflicts within the community. In Mesopotamia, the societies pursued similar goals, but with a stronger legal focus. The well-known legal texts, such as Hammurabi's Code, combine ethics and law in a way that shows that moral ideas were not just abstract ideals, but provided concrete instructions for everyday life. This reflected the idea that justice is both a personal and a social responsibility. Those who violated the laws endangered not only themselves, but also the social balance. The Mesopotamians closely associated ethics with order and punishment, but also with care and duty. Moral behavior meant protecting the weak, acting fairly, and fulfilling obligations to family, community, and deities. Despite the differences between Egypt and Mesopotamia, a common pattern can be identified. Ethics was not an abstract philosophy in both cultures, but deeply integrated into daily life. It offered orientation in a world marked by uncertainties and helped people to find their way within complex social structures. Moral action was a question of survival, social stability, and spiritual responsibility at the same time. The ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians thus showed that the roots of ethics do not lie in theoretical debates, but in the practical necessity to order and shape human coexistence. These early ideas of moral action laid the foundation for later philosophical developments. They show that ethics always arises from a need for order, harmony, and justice. Even though these early systems were strongly influenced by religion and law, they already revealed the foundations of a reflection on right action, which was later continued and refined in Greek philosophy, Christian ethics, and modern ethical theories. Chapter 4: Greek Philosophy, the Pre-Socratics. With the emergence of Greek philosophy in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, ethics began to break away from purely practical and religious norms and to become a reflective, theoretical discourse. The Pre-Socratics, a loose group of thinkers, searched for the basic principles that order the world, developing a way of thinking that also tried to explain human action. While they initially practiced mainly natural philosophy, they laid the foundation for ethical reflection by beginning to recognize the connections between cosmic order and human responsibility. For them, the world was an orderly whole in which everything had its place, and moral action meant living in harmony with these universal principles. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes searched for the primordial substance of which everything is made up, and recognized that the laws of nature could be a reflection of the order that also applies to human life. In this early phase, the idea that the right thing is not arbitrary but can be grasped by reason became apparent for the first time. Pythagoras combined the idea of harmony and moderation with ethical considerations. The moral good corresponded to an inner and outer balance, a life in harmony with numbers, proportions, and cosmic rhythms. These thinkers introduced the idea that virtue does not only concern external actions, but shapes the nature of man himself, shaping his character and ordering his life. Heraclitus, another pre-Socratic, emphasized the constant change and flow of all things. From his point of view, the moral life was a task of adaptation and insight. Those who understand the universe recognize the need to act in accordance with change, to accept conflicts, and to maintain balance. This early idea of ethics as an act of confrontation with reality lays a foundation for later philosophers who regarded virtue not as a rigid set of rules, but as a dynamic ability to lead a life. The Pre-Socratics profoundly influenced Greek philosophy by establishing the idea that morality and knowledge are connected. The search for the good was no longer exclusively religiously motivated, but an intellectual endeavor. The world was seen as a place that could be understood rationally, and right action arose from the insight into this order. Ethics thus became a discipline that focused on both man as an individual and his position in the world. Although the Pre-Socratics did not yet develop systematic ethics in the modern sense, they opened up a space for critical reflection on human action, which was later continued by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They laid the foundation for the idea that moral knowledge can be learned, and that life is only considered good if it is shaped in harmony with reason and order. In this way, they established philosophy as a continuous search for the good, which formed the basis for the development of Western ethics. Chapter 5. Greek Philosophy 2. Socrates and the Socratic Method. Socrates, who lived in Athens in the 5th century BC, marks a turning point in the history of ethics. Unlike the Pre-Socratics, he was less interested in the nature of the world and more in the nature of man and the question of how to live properly. For Socrates, ethical life was inseparable from knowledge. He who knows what is good will act well. Ignorance, he believed, was the root of all evil, and moral missteps result from a lack of insight. This was a radically new perspective that no longer understood ethics as a collection of rules, but as a discipline that requires reflection, knowledge, and constant self-examination. The method with which Socrates sought to promote this knowledge has become famous as the Socratic method. Through targeted questions and dialogue with his fellow citizens, he wanted to uncover hidden assumptions and get people to question their own beliefs. In these conversations, it became apparent that many people had seemingly certain ideas of justice, bravery, or virtue, but were unable to substantiate them on closer examination. Socrates taught that true moral knowledge can only be achieved through critical questioning and constant learning, and that a life that is not reflected on is not worth living. For Socrates, ethics was not a theoretical game, but a practical art of living. Virtue was the goal of human life, and virtue meant acting in accordance with reason. Courage, justice, moderation, and wisdom were not abstract concepts, but abilities that had to be developed through insight and practice. Moral action was thus closely linked to one's own character formation. Socrates made it clear that one must know oneself in order to act morally, and that this self-knowledge is a lifelong process. His influence on later ethics is immense. Plato, his pupil, took up Socratic ideas and developed them further. But Socrates himself focuses on the direct experience of dialogue and self-knowledge. Through his life and death, it became clear that moral convictions must not only be tested theoretically, but also practiced and defended. Socrates is therefore considered the founder of an ethics that inseparably combines knowledge, virtue, and practical action. The Socratic perspective on ethics changed the way people thought about morality. She showed that the right life is not determined by external regulations, but by inner insight and reflective action. This thinking laid the foundation for the systematic ethical considerations of Plato and Aristotle, which were to shape Western philosophy in the centuries that followed. Socrates made it clear that the search for the good does not have a definitive answer, but is a continuous process of self-examination and dialogue that constantly challenges man to question and improve his own life. Chapter 6. Plato, Doctrine of Ideas and Virtue Ethics. Plato, a student of Socrates, took Socratic considerations further and developed a comprehensive philosophical ethics that combined both metaphysical and practical aspects of human life. Central to Plato's thinking is the idea of ideas, immaterial, unchangeable archetypes that underlie visible things. In ethics, this means that virtues such as justice, wisdom, moderation, or bravery are not only relative or culturally conditioned qualities, but universal values that stand above the concrete world. The right action consists of shaping one's own life in harmony with these ideal forms and orienting oneself towards them. For Plato, the highest goal of human life is the harmony between soul and virtue. He describes the soul as threefold: the rational, the emotional, and the desiring part. Moral life requires the rational part to take the lead and reconcile the other two parts. Only when reason prevails can man act virtuously and lead a good life. In his dialogues, especially in the Politeia, Plato illustrates this idea by analyzing justice at both the individual and social levels. A just individual reflects within himself the order that should also prevail in a just society. Plato's virtue ethics is closely linked to the idea of education and self-knowledge. For him, virtue is not innate, but must be learned and cultivated. Philosophy, dialogue, and the pursuit of knowledge are means to shape the soul and deepen one's moral insight. In this sense, Plato combines theoretical reflection with practical life. Whoever recognizes the idea of the good will automatically do the right thing, because the knowledge of the good motivates action. Virtue and knowledge are thus inseparably linked for Plato, a view that he adopted directly from Socrates and systematically elaborated. In addition, Plato emphasizes the importance of community for ethical life. Individual virtue and social justice are interrelated. A virtuous individual contributes to the justice of the polis, while a just polis creates the conditions under which individuals can develop virtue. This reciprocal relationship shows that for Plato, ethics is not only a question of personal morality, but also has political dimensions. The moral responsibility of the individual is inseparable from his or her role in society, and the pursuit of the good is both an internal and an external endeavor. Plato's ethics has shaped philosophy to this day because it shows that moral life encompasses both knowledge and character, both individual and community. Through his theory of ideas and the emphasis on virtue as goal-oriented action, he led ethics from the realm of mere everyday practice to the realm of theoretical reflection, without losing touch with the concrete conduct of life. Only one who follows Plato's teachings recognizes that the pursuit of good is not just an abstract goal, but a lifelong process of self-formation and the conscious orientation of one's own actions. Chapter 7. Aristotle, Eudaimonia, and the Golden Mean. Aristotle, a student of Plato, developed ethics into a systematic work that encompassed both the theory and practice of human life. At the center of his thinking is the concept of eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or a prosperous life. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is not a fleeting feeling of joy, but the fully developed, fulfilled life achieved through the realization of one's abilities and through virtuous action. Moral living means developing one's potential and acting in harmony with the reason that distinguishes humans from other living beings. For Aristotle, the virtues are not abstract ideals, but concrete qualities that are developed through practice and habituation. Unlike Plato, he does not regard moral virtue as immediate knowledge, but as the ability to make right decisions. Central to this is the principle of the golden mean. Every virtue lies between two extremes, both of which are harmful. Courage, for example, is the middle ground between cowardice and arrogance, moderation between debauchery and self-denial, generosity between stinginess and waste. By striving for the golden mean, people learn to keep moderation and to lead a balanced, responsible life. Aristotle emphasizes that virtue cannot be considered in isolation. Moral action takes place in concrete situations, and people must learn to judge appropriately when and how they act. Reason, experience, and social insight are necessary to make the right decisions. Ethical living is therefore closely intertwined with everyday life and can only be cultivated through constant practice and reflection. Aristotle thus shows that ethics is a dynamic process that requires people to continuously examine and improve themselves. In addition, Aristotle recognizes the importance of community for the success of the good life. Humans are social beings by nature, and eudaimonia cannot be achieved in isolation. Virtue and happiness are inseparable from responsibility towards family, friends, and the polis. A just and virtuous society supports the individual pursuit of happiness, and at the same time, virtuous individuals contribute to the stability and prosperity of the community. This interplay between the individual and society makes Aristotle's ethics both personally and politically relevant. Aristotelian ethics is characterized by its pragmatism and its real-life orientation. It shows that moral action is not just a question of abstract principles, but requires the ability to act wisely and prudently in the real world. By combining virtue, reason, and social responsibility, Aristotle provides a model that still has an influence on philosophical ethics today. His idea of eudaimonia as the goal of life, achieved through the cultivation of virtues and the pursuit of the golden mean, offers a profound and, at the same time, practical orientation for the pursuit of a fulfilled and morally lived life. Chapter 8. Hellenistic Ethics, Stoicism and Epicureanism. After the death of Alexander the Great, Hellenistic culture spread across the Mediterranean world and gave rise to new philosophical directions that focused on individual life and the question of happiness and virtue. The political order of the polis became less important, and people sought ways to find inner peace and serenity in a world marked by uncertainty and change. Out of this situation developed Stoicism and Epicureanism, two systems of ethics that were similar in their objectives but very different in their approach. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that the highest good is virtue and that a person is happy only when he lives in accordance with reason. For the Stoics, the world was an orderly whole in which every event is necessary and part of a larger cosmic plan. Moral action meant controlling one's impulses, curbing passions, and maintaining inner peace, regardless of external circumstances. The Stoics held the view that external goods, such as wealth, health, or social status, have only secondary value. True happiness comes from the development of inner strength, wisdom, and self-control. By accepting nature and fate, people learn to live their lives calmly and realize that ethical responsibility always begins with oneself, regardless of the imponderables of the world. Epicureanism, developed by Epicurus, chose a different approach, more focused on individual well-being. Epicurus taught that the highest good was the pleasure principle, but he understood pleasure not as short-term pleasure, but as the absence of pain and the satisfaction of the soul. For the Epicurean, moral life means living moderately, cultivating friendships, and freeing oneself from excessive desires and fears. Epicurus regarded the fear of gods and death in particular as an obstacle to a fulfilled life. By overcoming these fears, one can achieve a life full of inner peace and joy. Epicurean ethics is pragmatic and true to life. It combines the search for happiness with the cultivated organization of everyday life and the pursuit of mental and emotional balance. Despite their differences, Stoicism and Epicureanism are united by the goal of harmonizing human life and achieving inner freedom. Both philosophies respond to a world in which external stability is uncertain, shifting the responsibility for the success of life to the individual. They show that ethics is not just a theoretical endeavor, but a concrete practice that requires mindfulness, self-reflection, and the conscious shaping of one's own life. While Stoicism emphasizes control over internal reactions and teaches adaptation to fate, Epicureanism seeks liberation from pain and fear in order to enable a life of joy and serenity. The Hellenistic ethics have deeply influenced the later philosophical tradition by focusing on individual life and emphasizing personal responsibility for one's own happiness. They show that ethics not only includes norms and rules, but is also a tool for ordering one's own life, finding inner peace, and leading a fulfilled existence in an uncertain world. Stoics and Epicureans thus offer two different paths that reflect man's universal search for happiness and moral integrity, and transform ethical reflection into a practical art of living. Chapter 9. Roman Ethics, Cicero, Seneca, and Epictetus. Roman philosophy took up Hellenistic ideas and adapted them to the practical reality of life in the Roman world. While Greece emphasized above all theoretical reflection and the pursuit of insight, in Rome the focus was on application and responsibility in everyday life. Philosophers such as Cicero, Seneca, and Epictetus combined ethics with political practice, social responsibility, and personal self-leadership, transforming the teachings of the Stoics and Epicureans into a concrete art of living. Cicero, a politician and orator, saw philosophy as a means of promoting the moral integrity of the individual and at the same time securing the common good. For him, the highest good was virtue, which is in harmony with reason and guides action in all areas of life. Cicero emphasized the importance of justice, a sense of duty and honesty, both towards oneself and towards the community. His thinking combines philosophical reflection with political ideals. Ethics is not only a personal concern, but a foundation for social coexistence. His writings show the conviction that moral clarity and inner stability form the basis for responsible action in politics and in daily life. Seneca, one of the most prominent representatives of Roman Stoicism, focused more on the inner attitude of man. In letters and tracts, he conveys the idea that passions and external adversities can be controlled when reason guides action. Seneca taught that true happiness does not depend on wealth, power, or status, but on the ability to maintain inner freedom and serenity. He emphasizes that life is unpredictable and that pain, loss, and injustice are inevitable. Moral life consists of meeting these challenges with wisdom and self-control. For Seneca, ethics is not a theoretical discipline, but a practical guide to mastering one's own existence and living a virtuous life that endures regardless of external circumstances. Epictetus, another important Stoic, took Stoic philosophy to an extremely pragmatic level. For him, the key to a good life is to distinguish between what is in our control and what is beyond our power. Paying attention only to what we can determine ourselves means freedom and serenity. External events, opinions of other people, or strokes of fate are inevitable, and those who accept them as neutral become unshakable inside. Epictetus combines the Stoic doctrine with strict self-discipline and the continuous training of the mind. The moral task is to consciously choose one's own actions, to shape one's own attitudes, and to make reason the constant guideline. Roman ethics is characterized by its practical relevance and relevance to life. It shows that ethical knowledge must not only be theory, but must be realized in concrete decisions and everyday actions. Cicero, Seneca, and Epictetus demonstrate that moral integrity, inner freedom, and the orientation of life towards virtue and reason form the basis for a fulfilled existence. At the same time, they reveal that ethical reflection in practice becomes a tool for overcoming adversity, taking responsibility, and shaping one's own life with wisdom and serenity. In this sense, Roman ethics represents a bridge between philosophical theory and lived life, which closely links the individual pursuit of happiness and moral perfection with the demands of social and political reality. Chapter 10. Medieval Ethics, Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. With the transition from ancient Greece and Rome to the Middle Ages, the focus of ethics shifted from the question of a rational life to man's relationship to God. Christianity became the dominant cultural force, and moral considerations were closely related to faith, divine law, and the orientation of human life toward the afterlife. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential thinkers of the era, coined the idea that man's ultimate goal is union with God. For Augustine, human nature is broken by original sin, and true virtue can only be achieved through divine grace and the will to God. Moral action is therefore not only a question of reason, but an expression of love for God and orientation toward the divine will. Augustine emphasizes that human happiness does not lie in worldly goods or personal successes, but in the relationship with God that takes man beyond the temporal. The ethical task is to order one's own desires, to overcome sinful tendencies, and to abandon the pursuit of worldly vanity in favor of an inner orientation toward the divine. In this sense, Augustine combines philosophy, theology, and morality by showing that ethical life must always be seen in a comprehensive metaphysical context. Virtue, justice, and charity thus receive a deep spiritual dimension that directly links individual action with the eternal goal of man. Thomas Aquinas, who worked in the 13th century, brought ancient philosophy into a systematic connection with Christian doctrine. Under the strong influence of Aristotle, he developed an ethics that takes into account both natural reason and divine law. According to Thomas, man is naturally directed towards the good, and through reason he can discern what is morally right. At the same time, he teaches that divine revelation and the sacraments support man in his moral development and lead him to eternal perfection. The ethics of Thomas Aquinas thus combines rational insight and principles of faith, whereby virtues are considered a means to shape life according to God's will and to achieve eudaimonia, perfect happiness. Central to medieval ethics is the idea of the hierarchy of goods and the moral order. The highest good is God Himself, and all other goods, be it wealth, knowledge, or political power, have only relative value. Moral action consists of correctly arranging goods, moderating one's own desires, and directing one's life towards eternal destiny. Augustine and Thomas both show that ethics in the Middle Ages was always thought of in the field of tension between human nature, reason, and divine guidance. The moral life is not merely a practical virtue, but a spiritual process in which man learns to know himself, to organize his passions, and to direct his life towards the highest goal. Medieval ethics still shapes thinking about morality, responsibility, and the connection between faith and reason. It shows that moral action goes far beyond individual decisions and encompasses the entire existence of man. By combining human aspiration, reason, and divine order, it offers a comprehensive perspective in which ethics, spirituality, and life design are inseparably linked, and the goal of life is always seen in a higher, transcendent sense. Chapter 11. Renaissance and Humanism, Rediscovery of Antiquity. The Renaissance marked a turning point in European intellectual history, in which ethics once again turned its gaze to human life, this time in connection with the rediscovery of ancient philosophy. Humanist thinkers of the time turned away from the exclusive orientation towards the divine and placed the individual and his abilities at the center. Human reason, education, creativity, and character development were seen as central means to living a full and virtuous life. Renaissance ethics consciously took up the ideals of Greek and Roman philosophy, especially Aristotle, Cicero, and Seneca, and combined them with Christian morality. For humanists such as Erasmus of Rotterdam, virtue meant not only religious piety, but the cultivation of the human spirit and character. Moral action was closely linked to education and self-knowledge, with the ability to act thoughtfully and to treat fellow human beings justly in the foreground. Ethics was thus at the same time a practical art of living and philosophical reflection, in which man, as a free rational being, took responsibility for his actions and the shaping of his life. Unlike in the Middle Ages, worldliness now came into focus. Human happiness could not lie solely in the relationship with God, but in the realization of one's own abilities, in social relationships, and an active participation in social life. The rediscovery of antiquity brought together the ideal of vita activa and vita contemplativa. Man should develop virtue through thoughtful study as well as through practical action. Aristotelian virtue ethics were combined with a new awareness of individual freedom and responsibility, while Stoic serenity and Epicurean art of living were received as a means of self-leadership and inner balance. Moral life meant ordering one's own passions, keeping moderation, acquiring knowledge, and meeting fellow human beings in friendship and justice. Renaissance ethics thus combined the inner shaping of life with the external shaping of society, and made it clear that the pursuit of virtue and happiness is not a purely private matter, but includes the responsibility of the individual for his environment. Humanistic ethics was also characterized by a new trust in the possibilities of man. The assumption that education, art, and science can perfect the human being morally and intellectually opened up a perspective in which the pursuit of a good life was understood not as a gift of fate, but as an active achievement. Moral action was no longer just obedience to divine commandments, but an expression of a reflective, rational practice of life. The Renaissance thus opened the door to a modern conception of ethics in which the human being, as a creative, self-determined being, took responsibility for his life, his decisions, and his moral development. The humanistic ethics of the Renaissance shows that morality does not consist in abstract rules, but in the ability of man to consciously shape his life, to practice virtues, and to take responsibility for himself and others. It combines intellectual education with practical lifestyle, individual freedom with social responsibility, and theoretical insight with everyday action. In this sense, the Renaissance laid the foundation for the modern understanding of ethics as an integral part of human life, in which self-reflection, education, and the orientation towards the good play central roles. Chapter 12. Early Modern Period, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Political Ethics. The early modern period brought with it profound upheavals in politics, society, and philosophy, which also changed ethics permanently. The age of discovery, the Reformation, and the increasing centralization of the state placed the relationship between power, morality, and human nature at the center of philosophical reflection. While the Renaissance emphasized the virtue of the individual, the question of how people can live together in societies marked by conflict, uncertainty, and political interests now came to the fore. Machiavelli and Hobbes are the two formative thinkers of this era, whose approaches redefined political ethics in a realistic, sometimes provocative way. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine politician and thinker, broke with the traditional idea that politics and morality are inextricably linked. In his work Il Principe, he shows that rulers are often forced to make decisions that seem reprehensible according to conventional morality in order to secure power and ensure stability. For Machiavelli, securing the state is the primary goal, and ethical action must be subordinated to political necessity. Virtue in the traditional sense thus loses its absolute validity. What is more important is prudence, foresight, and the ability to recognize and seize opportunities. His thinking emphasizes the tension between moral ideals and the reality of human action, resulting in a new, pragmatic perspective on ethics and politics. Thomas Hobbes, who worked a few decades later, developed an ethics that is deeply rooted in anthropology. In his work Leviathan, he describes man as selfish, quarrelsome, and striving for power by nature, which leads to a war of all against all without a strong political order. For Hobbes, moral rules, virtues, and justice are not immutable values, but conventions that serve to secure social peace. The state, represented by a central authority, is necessary to enforce these rules and enable orderly coexistence. Ethics and law thus become instruments of political stability, and the moral obligation of the individual is to respect the order that guarantees the survival and well-being of the community. Both Machiavelli and Hobbes shift the ethical perspective from individual virtues to the conditions of social coexistence. While Machiavelli focuses on power and the pragmatic wisdom of the ruler, Hobbes examines the foundations of morality as a necessary condition for order and security. Both show that ethics in the early modern period is closely linked to political reality, and that moral principles can only be meaningfully understood in the context of human nature, social conditions, and political power. This epoch teaches that moral action is not only aimed at personal virtue, but must always be thought of in relation to society and its institutions. Ethics thus becomes analytical, pragmatic, and realistic. It reflects the conditions of human action, the conflicts and constraints of social reality, and the need to reconcile power, security, and community. The early modern period shows that moral philosophy cannot remain abstract, but must face the challenges of the political order, and that the questions of power, law, and responsibility are central components of any ethical reflection. Chapter 13. Enlightenment, Kant, Hume, and the Ethics of Reason. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries brought about a profound change in philosophy and ethics, in which reason, rationality, and critical thinking became the focus of moral reflection. The thinkers of this era believed that through reason and insight, man could recognize moral principles and shape his life accordingly, regardless of tradition, authority, or mere religious precept. David Hume and Immanuel Kant are among the central figures whose respective approaches fundamentally shaped the ethics of the Enlightenment, even if they took very different paths. David Hume argued that moral action is deeply rooted in human feelings and sensations. According to Hume, reason alone is not capable of generating moral obligations. It can only serve as a tool to identify the means for certain ends. Rather, morality arises from compassion, sympathy, and the ability to understand the feelings of other people. Virtues such as justice, generosity, and honesty are determined not by abstract laws, but by man's natural inclination to promote harmony and benevolence in the community. Hume emphasizes that ethics is an expression of human emotional life and that moral norms emerge in social interaction, with moral reason mediating rather than dictating. In contrast, Immanuel Kant developed a strictly rationalist ethics based on universal principles. Kant assumes that moral action does not depend on feelings or consequences, but follows solely from duty, which reason recognizes as a moral commandment. His categorical imperative demands that everyone should act in such a way that the underlying maxim can also be valid as a general law. According to Kant, moral action is an expression of the autonomy of the will and the ability of man to give himself moral laws that are universally valid. Respect for the dignity of each individual plays a central role in this. People must never be treated merely as a means to an end, but are an end in themselves. Kant's approach shows that ethics is not relative, but is based on fixed, rationally justifiable principles that all rational beings must recognize. In its ethics, the Enlightenment combines the hope for human reason with the demand for moral autonomy and critical thinking. It opens up a perspective in which people not only judge morally, but actively take responsibility, reflect on their actions, and adhere to principles regardless of external constraints. Hume shows the importance of empathy and social compassion as the basis of morality, while Kant emphasizes the normative power of reason and the universal validity of moral laws. Together, they shape the modern understanding of ethics, which is both rationally and socially anchored, which relates thought and feeling, a sense of duty and human inclinations, and understands moral reflection as the basis of a responsible life. In this epoch, it becomes clear that ethics is not just a reflection on virtues, but a concrete guide on how people can act in freedom, responsibility, and social sensitivity. The Enlightenment teaches that moral judgments must be based on both insight and empathy, that principles can be universal without negating the individuality of the doer, and that man is capable of living a life that is both just and meaningful through reason and compassion. Thus, the ethics of the Enlightenment represents a decisive bridge between the moral traditions of the past and the modern idea of ethical responsibility, freedom, and reason. Chapter 14. German Idealism, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel's Ethics. With the emergence of German idealism at the beginning of the 19th century, ethics once again shifted to a philosophical depth in which the relationship between the individual, freedom, and the world becomes central. After the Enlightenment, philosophers such as Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel sought a systematic justification of moral action that was not only based on reason or feeling, but also focused on the reality of human freedom and the development of the spirit. For German idealism, ethics is inseparably linked to the self-realization of man and the development of his intellectual abilities, whereby moral action is understood as an expression of an inner process of freedom. Fichte developed an ethics that is strongly oriented towards the autonomous action of the individual. For him, the highest goal of man lies in self-determination and the moral responsibility that results from freedom. Moral action is not merely the observance of external commandments, but the realization of one's own freedom in accordance with the principle of legality and respect for the freedom of others. Man is thought of as an active subject who shapes his world and assumes responsibility, whereby every action is at the same time an expression of an inner legislation. For Fichte, ethics is thus inseparably linked to self-confidence and personal development, and moral life means respecting and realizing one's own freedom and that of one's fellow human beings. Schelling, on the other hand, emphasized the unity of nature, spirit, and freedom and saw ethics as the task of recognizing and living this unity. Moral action is an expression of a harmonious relationship between the individual and the world, in which freedom, creativity, and responsibility are intertwined. Schelling's ethics does not consider the human being in isolation, but as part of a larger whole, in which every action has a repercussion on the world. Through moral insight and creative activity, man can shape the world, develop his own potential, and contribute to the realization of a higher order that goes beyond mere individual interests. Finally, Hegel integrated ethics into his comprehensive philosophy of mind, developing a concept in which moral norms, freedom, and social reality are inextricably linked. For Hegel, moral action is not only an individual virtue, but part of historical and social development. Reason manifests itself in institutions, legal systems, and the social order, and man develops his moral freedom by assuming responsibility in these structures and reconciling his actions with the good of the community. Ethics becomes a dynamic process in which the individual, society, and history are intertwined. And moral life means engaging oneself in the development of the mind and the world. German idealism shows that ethics is more than the observance of rules or the cultivation of virtues. It is an expression of freedom, self-confidence, and responsibility in a comprehensive context of the individual and the world. Moral action arises from the conscious realization of one's own freedom, from the ability to recognize oneself and others, and from the striving for harmony between personal development and social order. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel emphasize the creative and active role of humans. Ethics is not passive behavior, but a process that enables the individual to shape his life, to develop his freedom, and to take responsibility in the world. German idealism thus leaves behind an ethics that is both individually and socially oriented, that combines freedom, responsibility, and reason, and that understands moral action as an ongoing task of man in an evolving historical context. This philosophy laid the foundation for later ethical reflections that further examined the tension between the individual, society, and moral responsibility, and carried the idea of an ethics anchored in freedom and history into the modern age. Chapter 15: Utilitarianism and the Ethics of Utility, Bentham and Mill. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the profound social changes in the 18th and 19th centuries, an ethics gained an importance that not only looked at the actions of the individual, but also at the consequences for the community. Utilitarianism, developed by Jeremy Bentham and later continued by John Stuart Mill, set the standard for moral action on the greatest happiness of the greatest possible number. Moral action was no longer primarily determined by duty or inner virtue, but by the consequences it has for the well-being of others. This pragmatic perspective brought ethics into direct relation to social justice, political reform, and the needs of society. Jeremy Bentham, a lawyer and social reformer, argued that the moral measure of any action is its contribution to maximizing joy and minimizing suffering. For Bentham, joy and sorrow are measurable variables, and ethical decisions can be calculated rationally by weighing the consequences of an action. The ethics of utilitarianism is thus strongly practice-oriented and aims at concrete improvements in people's lives. Bentham even developed a philosophic calculus, a kind of computational method to determine the moral correctness of actions according to their usefulness. In his thinking, morality and utility are closely linked, with any action that promotes the happiness of most people considered good. John Stuart Mill took up Bentham's approach but refined it with a more nuanced view of the quality of pleasure. For Mill, not all pleasures are created equal. Spiritual and moral pleasures have a higher value than purely physical pleasures, and moral action should aim to fully promote human development and well-being. Mill emphasized the importance of individual freedom as long as it does not compromise the well-being of others, and linked utilitarianism to the idea of social responsibility. Moral decisions are therefore not only a question of maximizing happiness, but also of promoting personal development, education, and justice within society. Utilitarianism shifts the ethical perspective from abstract rules and individual virtues to the consequences of human action and the effect on others. Moral action is pragmatic, future-oriented, and community-oriented at its core, and ethical reflection requires careful consideration of benefits and harms. This orientation makes utilitarianism particularly suitable for addressing ethical issues in political, economic, and social contexts where decisions have a major impact on many people. At the same time, it raises questions about justice, equality, and individual responsibility that go far beyond the mere summation of joy and sorrow. Utilitarianism taught that ethics must not remain an abstraction, but must always take into account the real living conditions, needs, and interests of people. Bentham and Mill showed that moral action can be practical, reflective, and consequential, and that the promotion of the common good is a central benchmark for ethical decisions. At the same time, her philosophy opens up a dialogue between individual freedom, social responsibility, and the search for the greatest possible happiness, making ethics a living instrument for shaping human life in a social context, reducing suffering, and promoting the well-being of the community. Chapter 16: Existentialism and the Ethics of Freedom, Kierkegaard and Sartre. In the 19th and 20th centuries, existentialism brought individual experience, freedom, and the responsibility of the individual to the center of ethical reflection. In a world that was increasingly characterized by uncertainty, social upheavals, and crises of meaning, thinkers such as Søren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre searched for an ethics that took seriously the concrete life of man, his decisions, and his existential responsibility. Morality here is no longer just a system of rules or consequences, but an expression of the conscious decision of the individual, who must shape his life authentically. Søren Kierkegaard, often referred to as the father of existentialism, emphasized the subjective dimension of morality. For him, ethical action is closely linked to the personal relationship with oneself and with God. Humans are faced with existential decisions that cannot be completely dictated by universally valid norms, but require individual reflection, courage, and a sense of responsibility. Moral life means recognizing oneself in depth, taking one's own freedom seriously, and taking responsibility for one's own actions, even if this entails fear, doubt, and loneliness. Kierkegaard showed that ethics is not abstract but deeply personal, that it arises from the confrontation with one's own existence, and that moral decisions have existential consequences. Jean-Paul Sartre, in the 20th century, developed this perspective further and radicalized the idea of freedom and responsibility. According to Sartre, man is condemned to freedom. He is free to make decisions, and this freedom cannot be reduced to external authorities or predetermined values. Moral action is the conscious choice of a life plan in which the individual takes responsibility for himself and for the world. Every decision has an effect beyond the individual life because it represents an example of human action and thus claims universal validity. Sartre associates this with freedom, responsibility, and authenticity. Ethics is not predetermined, but comes alive through the decisions and actions of the individual. Existentialism shifts the focus of ethics from adherence to rules and utility maximization to individual freedom and existential responsibility. Moral action becomes a process of becoming conscious, self-shaping, and authenticity, in which people create their own values and take their existence seriously. Kierkegaard and Sartre show that ethics is not solely dependent on social conventions or abstract principles, but grows out of the living experience of the individual and the conscious confrontation with freedom, responsibility, and meaning. This view teaches that moral life always has a personal dimension, and that responsibility for one's own decisions cannot be delegated. Freedom is both a burden and an opportunity. Morality arises in the encounter with one's own existence, and the ethics of existentialism calls on people to shape their lives consciously, reflectively, and authentically. It opens up a space in which individual experience, choice, and personal responsibility form the basis of all ethical action, and shows that morality is not just a matter of reason or social order, but the living result of human freedom and existence. Chapter 17. Feminist Ethics, Gilligan and the Ethics of Care. In the late 20th century, a new perspective on ethics emerged, which critically questioned the predominant, often male-dominated approaches and focused on the role of relationship, care, and context. Feminist ethicists such as Carol Gilligan pointed out that traditional ethical theories, from Kant to the utilitarian tradition, are often abstract, universalizing, and principled, while human moral life is just as strongly shaped by relationships, empathy, and responsibility for one another. The ethics of care places the human context, the togetherness, and the concrete needs of people at the center of moral considerations. Carol Gilligan showed in her studies that women often have a different approach to morality, which is more focused on empathy, compassion, and the maintenance of relationships. She criticized that traditional moral theories underrepresented the ethical perspective of women and neglected the importance of care, connectedness, and mutual responsibility. For Gilligan, moral action is not just the application of abstract rules or the weighing of benefits, but the ability to recognize relationships, consider the needs of others, and take responsibility in a concrete social context. The ethics of care emphasizes that moral decisions are often complex, multi-layered, and situational, and that human well-being, mutual support, and attention to the environment are essential components of a moral life. Feminist ethics expands the traditional perspective by showing that morality is not just a matter of universal principles or abstract norms, but is deeply rooted in everyday life, interpersonal relationships, and the social fabric. She emphasizes that power structures, social roles, and gendered experiences influence moral judgment, and that ethical action must not be understood in isolation, but in dependence on community, responsibility, and care. Moral responsibility here becomes relational. Individuals are responsible not only for their own actions, but also for the quality of the relationships in which they are involved, and for the way they affect the lives of others. The ethics of care shows that in practice, moral thinking often needs to be situational, empathetic, and flexible to meet the complex demands of human interaction. It complements and critiques existing ethical systems by emphasizing the importance of attention, compassion, and social responsibility, and showing that moral life remains incomplete without consideration of relationships, context, and care. Feminist ethics teaches that morality is more than adherence to principles or the calculation of consequences. It is lived responsibility, care, and sensitivity for the world and the people around us. Chapter 18. Modern Applied Ethics. Modern Applied Ethics, Bioethics, Environmental Ethics, and Digital Ethics. In the transition to the 20th and 21st centuries, ethics has increasingly grappled with concrete, practical questions arising from scientific progress, technological innovation, and environmental challenges. Abstract theories are replaced by questions that affect everyday life, society, and global conditions. Bioethics, environmental ethics, and digital ethics are expressions of this change. They make it clear that moral thinking is not only philosophical reflection, but requires direct responsibility for the effects of human action on other living beings, on nature, and on the digital world. Bioethics emerged as a reaction to developments in medicine, biotechnology, and genetic research. Questions of medical research, patients' rights, genetic engineering, and the dignity of life came to the fore. Moral considerations in bioethics do not only concern individual decisions, but the way in which knowledge is applied, what risks and opportunities arise, and how human dignity and autonomy are respected. Bioethics requires that medical decisions are not made solely on the basis of efficiency or benefit, but that responsibility, empathy, and the principle of non-harm are guided. Ethics becomes directly practical here because it decides on life, death, health, and the well-being of people. Environmental ethics extends this area of responsibility to the natural world and the ecosystems in which humans live. In the face of climate change, species extinction, and resource scarcity, moral action is becoming a question of global responsibility. Human action is not isolated. It affects the well-being of future generations and the stability of the planet. Environmental ethics demands that humanity reconcile its own interests with its responsibility towards nature, animals, and future generations. Moral principles such as sustainability, respect for nature, and respect for life in all its forms become guidelines that aim beyond individual freedom to collective responsibility. The digital revolution has created a new dimension of ethical reflection. Digital ethics deals with questions of data protection, artificial intelligence, social networking, and the responsibility of companies and individuals in the digital space. Moral action in the digital age means considering the consequences of technological developments, taking responsibility for data and information, and applying ethical principles in a fast-paced, globally networked environment. This shows that ethics is not static, but must always adapt to new social, technological, and ecological conditions in order to remain relevant and effective. Modern applied ethics makes it clear that morality does not remain an abstraction, but has concrete effects on life, society, and the environment. Bioethics, environmental ethics, and digital ethics are expressions of a moral awareness that combines responsibility, reflection, and agency. They show that ethical thinking must take the challenges of the present seriously, focus on the well-being of others, sustainability, and the consequences of human action, and that moral principles are implemented in everyday life and in social processes. In this way, ethics becomes alive, practical, and indispensable for a responsible life in a complex world. Chapter 19: Ethics in the 21st Century: Global Justice, Human Rights, and Technological Responsibility. The 21st century presents ethics with challenges of unprecedented dimensions. Increasing globalization, growing inequality between and within states, threats to the environment, and rapidly advancing technological development require moral reflection that thinks not only locally but globally. Ethics in today's age therefore deals intensively with questions of justice, human rights, and responsibility in dealing with technologies that have far-reaching consequences for individuals, societies, and the planet. Global justice is a central ethical focus of our time because economic and social inequalities pose fundamental challenges. Moral action here means making the distribution of resources, opportunities, and wealth fair and questioning structures that perpetuate inequality. Philosophers such as Thomas Pogge and Martha Nussbaum emphasize that ethical responsibility goes beyond national borders and that globalization also has a moral dimension. It is not enough to cultivate individual virtues. It is necessary to reflect on institutions, political systems, and economic practices for their justice in order to ensure that people worldwide can live in dignity, security, and freedom. Human rights form the ethical foundation of global justice. They are an expression of a universal responsibility that grants every human being equal dignity and equal rights to freedom, protection, and participation. Ethics in the 21st century interprets human rights not only as legal norms, but as moral obligations that guide action, politics, and social coexistence. Respect for human rights means critically examining power and responsibility, combating discrimination and oppression, and ensuring that technological, economic, and social developments do not lead to new forms of inequality or violence. Technological responsibility is another dominant topic of modern ethics. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, robotics, and digital platforms open up unimagined possibilities, but also pose risks that can profoundly affect human life, privacy, democracy, and the environment. Moral action in the digital age requires critical reflection, foresight, and a responsible use of technology. It is not enough to consider technological innovation as an end in itself. Their application must always take into the account on people, communities, and the environment. Ethical responsibility thus becomes a universal task that affects individuals as well as companies, governments, and international institutions. The ethics of the 21st century show that moral thinking never remains isolated. It calls for a perspective that includes the individual as well as society, local and global structures, the present as well as the future. Global justice, human rights, and technological responsibility are not abstract concepts, but concrete tasks that require conscious, reflective, and responsible action. Morality in our time requires courage, foresight, and commitment to shape a world in which freedom, dignity, justice, and sustainability do not remain empty concepts but lived reality for all people. Chapter 20: Outlook and Summary: The Future of Ethics. If you look at the history of ethics from the early philosophical reflections to the present, you can see a picture that is characterized by both continuity and profound change. Ethics has always been a reflection of the social, cultural, and technological conditions of its time. It began with questions about the right life and the virtue of the individual, evolved from rationalist and utilitarian approaches to reflections on freedom, responsibility, and care, and today reaches dimensions that include global justice, human rights, and technological responsibility. Ethics never remains static, but grows with the challenges that humanity poses to itself and its environment. The development shows that moral thinking is always related to the concrete circumstances of people's lives. In antiquity, ethics was directed towards the development of virtue and the good life within the framework of the polis. In the Middle Ages, towards the harmony of faith and reason. In modern times, towards rational principles, the weighing of benefits, and individual freedom. Modern approaches such as feminist ethics, bioethics, environmental ethics, and digital ethics expand this spectrum by pointing out the complexity of human relationships, responsibility towards other living beings, and the consequences of technological innovations. Ethics is thus no longer just philosophical theory, but practical reflection on the consequences of our actions on people, societies, and the planet. The future of ethics will increasingly be shaped by global challenges. Climate change, resource scarcity, social inequality, migration, and technological upheavals require moral thinking that looks beyond national, cultural, and temporal boundaries. The ethical responsibility of an individual is inextricably linked to the responsibility for the community, the environment, and future generations. Moral action means thinking long-term, considering different perspectives, and understanding the interactions between individual freedom and collective responsibility. Ethics thus remains a dynamic field that calls on people to continuously reflect on their own actions and bring them into line with larger goals of justice, compassion, and sustainability. The history of ethics teaches that moral principles, as much as they may seem time-bound, always go back to universal questions of human life. How should one live? What is good? How can you take responsibility? These questions never lose their meaning, even if the contexts change. The ethics of the future must continue to be flexible, reflective, and action-oriented in order to meet the challenges of a globalized and technologized world. It must respect human freedom, recognize the diversity of experiences, and at the same time emphasize the obligation to other living beings and the environment. Ultimately, the development of ethics shows that it is far more than an intellectual endeavor. It is lived practice, reflection on the consequences of our actions, and orientation for living together. Ethics connects the individual conscience with social responsibility, the past with the present, and the present with the future. By bringing together questions of justice, care, freedom, and responsibility, it provides tools to understand and meaningfully shape life's complex challenges. The future of ethics therefore lies in the ability of people to act consciously, empathetically, and responsibly, to create a world in which human action respects both the dignity of the individual and the well-being of the community and the earth.